The men who sailed under him called him the damned Dutchman, and some of them feared him more than they feared the sea. He had hidden his own name for 40 years, a German in command of an American warship in a war against Germany. But the captain was only the first strange thing about her. On the 4th of March, 1918, his ship left the harbour at Barbados, riding low and heavy with oar, and steamed north for Baltimore with more than 300 souls aboard. She never arrived. No wreck rose, no lifeboat drifted in, no body ever washed ashore, and not one word of distress crossed the wire, though she carried a wireless set and a promised day in port. She remains the largest ship the United States Navy has ever lost, and to this day, no one can say how. What took the Cyclops in that quiet water? If the great ships and the disasters that swallowed them pull at you, subscribe and stay to the end, because what happened to this one is stranger and quieter than almost anyone expects. On the 4th of March, 1918, a warship longer than a city block steamed out of Barbados and simply ceased to be. She was the United States Navy collier Cyclops, 542 feet of grey steel, and she carried more than 300 men, a mountain of ore, and a captain no one aboard entirely trusted. She had a course to steer and a date to keep, the 13th of March, when she was due at Baltimore. She steamed out past the harbour mouth, turned her bow toward the north, and sailed straight off the edge of the known world. Nothing about her was ever found again. Think about what that means, because it is easy to say and very hard to truly hold in the mind. Ships are enormous things, and they do not vanish the way a coin vanishes or a letter goes astray. When a great ship dies, she leaves a wound on the surface of the sea. She spills oil in a long, dark smear. She throws off lifeboats and life rings and shattered planking and the 10,000 floating fragments of the lives she carried, and those things drift for weeks and wash up on far shores. She sends out a cry on the wireless, a position, a plea, some last electric word flung into the air before the water climbs the aerials, and she leaves the dead. The sea is patient, and the sea is thorough, and in the end, the sea gives back the drowned. That is the ordinary arithmetic of disaster. The Cyclops obeyed none of it. There was no oil. There was no wreckage. There was no wireless call, though she was fitted to send one, and every operator along the coast was later asked, and none had heard a whisper. There were no bodies, not one, not then, and not in all the centuries since. A ship that displaced some 19,000 tons at her full load, a floating thing the length of 1.5 football fields, went into the ocean between two friendly ports in good sailing weather, and left behind her an absence so clean and so total that it reads less like a sinking than like an erasure. She did not go down so much as she went out, the way a candle goes out, here in one instant and gone in the next. That absence is the whole of the story, and it is why the Cyclops has never let go of the people who study her. A sinking, however terrible, is a thing that can be understood. There is a cause, and there is a wreck, and there is a grave, and grief, in time, finds something to close its hands around. The men of the Cyclops left their families nothing to close their hands around at all. No telegram of the ship going down. No survivor to say how it happened or whether it was quick. No stone to stand over. Only a date on a calendar after which a husband, a son, a brother, simply was no longer anywhere in the world, and no living person could say why. The United States Navy, which does not frighten easily and does not admit bafflement lightly, has never been able to explain her. The best minds it could bring to the question studied the ship, the cargo, the captain, the weather, and the war. And at the end of all of it, the Navy wrote a sentence that still stands as the official truth more than 100 years later. Many theories have been advanced, it concluded, but none that satisfactorily accounts for her disappearance. That is as close as the most powerful navy on Earth has ever come to saying of one of its own great ships that it does not know. And there was, from the very beginning, something wrong with her that had nothing to do with the sea. The man on her bridge was not who the Navy Register said he was. He had been born under another name, in another country, the very country the United States was then fighting, and he had spent 4 decades burying that fact beneath a life he had invented for himself. His crew despised him. His fellow officers would barely share a table with him. And in the last port that ever saw the Cyclops alive, the American consul who dealt with him came away so uneasy that he sent his government a warning he could not fully explain. A warning that he feared for the ship a fate, in his words, worse than sinking. Set her loss beside the other great disasters of the sea, and the strangeness only sharpens. The famous sinkings are famous in part because so much survived them, the lifeboats and the survivors, and the wireless calls that let the world watch the horror unfold almost as it happened. The Cyclops gave the world none of that. She was larger than many a celebrated liner, 542 feet of her, carrying more men than a small warship's full company, and she left behind less than a rowing boat lost off a beach leaves behind. There was more physical trace of a single drowned fisherman than of a United States warship and every man who sailed in her. That is the measure of the thing, and it is why she has never once been allowed to rest. Hold that phrase. A fate worse than sinking. It was written by a careful man about a captain he had met only briefly, and he admitted himself that it might be nothing more than instinct and dislike. But he sent it anyway, in an official telegram, days before the Cyclops disappeared with every soul aboard her. To understand what could make a warship and 300 men vanish without a single trace, the story has to begin a long way from that quiet Caribbean water. It has to begin with what the Cyclops was, and why a nation building the greatest navy in its history needed a ship as unglamorous as a floating heap of coal. She was never meant to be beautiful, only enormous and useful, and always there when the fleet ran dry. There are no crowds in the photographs of the Cyclops, no bands playing, no launching day multitudes cheering a national marvel down the ways. She was a collier, a coal ship, the least romantic vessel in the whole of the United States Navy, and she was one of the most important. To understand why she mattered, and why her loss struck the Navy so hard, you have to understand the strange and hungry age of steam that she was built to serve. At the start of the 20th century, the United States was building a modern steel navy, a fleet of grey battleships meant to carry American power out across the oceans and announce that a new great power had arrived. Those battleships were the pride of the nation, and they were photographed and painted and cheered wherever they went. But a battleship is, at bottom, a furnace that floats. Every one of those proud grey giants burned coal, tons upon tons of it, hurling it by hand into roaring boilers to make the steam that turned the shafts that drove her through the water. A fleet at sea was a fleet slowly starving, its coal bunkers emptying with every mile, and a warship with empty bunkers was not a warship at all. It was a vast iron island, helpless and adrift. So the whole gleaming enterprise of the Steel Navy rested in the end on an unglamorous foundation of coal and on the humble ships that carried it. The collier was the servant that made the master possible. She went to the coaling ports and filled her holds with thousands of tons of the black rock, and then she went out to wherever the fleet was, and she came alongside the battleships and the cruisers and fed them. It was filthy, endless, back-breaking work, the coal dust settling over everything and everyone. and it was the quiet miracle that kept a navy alive at sea. Without her kind, the Great Fleet could not have crossed an ocean. With her, it could go anywhere in the world and stay there. The Cyclops was built to be one of the largest and most capable of these servants. She was one of 4 sister ships of a single class, all built to the same design, great slab-sided vessels with a distinctive forest of tall coaling derricks rising from their decks, the cranes and booms that swung the coal across to the waiting warships. She could carry a colossal load, and she was designed to work anywhere the fleet was sent, in the Baltic, in the Caribbean, off the coast of Mexico, wherever grey ships needed feeding. She was named, with a certain grim aptness, for the Cyclops of the old Greek stories, the one-eyed giants who laboured at the forge and hammered out the thunderbolts of the gods. She was a giant, and she laboured, and she made the fire of the fleet possible. Consider her scale, because it is the scale that makes the vanishing so hard to accept. She measured 542 feet from bow to stern, near enough to 1.5 football fields laid end to end. Across the beam, she was 65 feet wide. At her full load, she displaced something close to 19,000 tons, and she could drive that whole enormous mass through the water at 15 knots on her 2 great engines and their twin screws. She was rated to carry 8,000 tons of coal in normal service, and she could be crammed with as much as 10,800 tons if she was pushed to her limit. That is a quantity of weight that resists the imagination, a small black mountain packed down into a steel hull and sent out across the sea. For years, she did exactly the work she had been built for, and she did it without drama. She fueled the fleet on its exercises. She carried coal down to the warm waters of the Caribbean and across to Europe. During the American occupation of the Mexican port of Veracruz, she coaled the patrolling warships, and she earned the formal thanks of the State Department for helping to carry refugees away from the fighting. She was a workhorse, reliable and enormous and almost invisible, the kind of ship whose name never reached the newspapers because nothing about her ever went wrong. She was the ship you did not think about, precisely because she always did her job. Picture the work she was built for, because it was a spectacle in itself. Coming alongside a battleship in a rolling sea, the 2 great hulls surging together and apart, the tall derricks swinging their heavy buckets of coal across the gap hour after hour, hundreds of tons of it, while men, black to the eyes, shoveled and hauled in the choking dust. A full coaling could take the better part of a day and leave every soul aboard both ships filthy and spent. The Cyclops did this again and again across her years of service in the Baltic and the Caribbean and off the coast of Mexico, an ugly, vital, ceaseless labour that no one sang about and no one could do without. She asked for no glory and was given none, and she earned, in exchange, the quiet certainty that she was needed. And then the United States went to war, and the quiet workhorse was handed a new and heavier task, one that would take her far from the fleet she was built to serve and send her down alone into the South Atlantic, carrying not the light black coal she was designed for, but something far denser, far stranger, and far more dangerous to a ship built the way she was. To understand why that mattered, you have to go back to the Philadelphia yard where she was born, and to the single choice in her design that would, years later, help to kill her. In a Philadelphia yard, they gave her a spine of long iron beams, engineered for one cargo and one alone. The Cyclops was built by William Cramp and Sons, one of the great American shipbuilders of the age, at their yards on the Delaware River. She was laid down and framed and plated in the first years of the century, and she slid down into the water in the spring of 1910, a new servant for a growing fleet. She was, by the standards of her day, a thoroughly modern ship, well found and strongly built, and there was nothing in her construction that any inspector of the time would have called a flaw. And yet the seed of her destruction was laid into her at the building slip, in the most basic decision of all, the decision of what she was for. She was for coal. Every choice in her design flowed from that single purpose. And to understand her fate, you have to understand a little of how a ship like her is held together. A long ship is a beam, in the engineering sense, a great slender structure supported unevenly by the water beneath her, and she is under constant, shifting strain along her whole length. When a wave lifts her at the bow and the stern, while her middle hangs unsupported over a trough, her back is bent one way. When a wave lifts her amidships while her ends droop, her back is bent the other. All day and all night, in any sea at all, a ship is being flexed and worked like a bar of metal bent slowly back and forth. And what keeps her from breaking is the strength that runs the length of her hull, the great longitudinal beams and girders that are, in effect, her spine. The Cyclops had such a spine, a structure of long iron beams running fore and aft down the length of her, and it was entirely adequate for the work she was designed to do. Coal is a relatively light cargo. A hold full of coal is heavy, of course, but the weight is spread through a large volume, and it presses on the structure of the ship in a way her builders had planned for exactly. She could fill her holds with coal until she was down to her marks, and the loads would sit where they were meant to sit, and her iron spine would carry the strain across any ocean without complaint. For the cargo she was built to carry, she was a sound and a safe ship. That is the cruel heart of it. She was not badly built. She was built for one thing, and one day she would be asked to do another. There was a second quiet vulnerability in her, and it too came from the coal. Coal, as it sits wet in the iron holds of a ship, gives off a weak acid, and that acid works slowly on metal year after year, voyage after voyage. On ships of her class, the long iron beams that formed the spine were found, in time, to corrode and thin where the cargo pressed against them, the very structure that held the ship together being gnawed at, invisibly, by the very substance she was built to carry. It was slow, and it was hidden, and on any given day it looked like nothing at all. But it meant that a collier grew weaker as she aged, her spine quietly eaten from within, so that a hull which had been amply strong when she was new might be carrying, a decade later, a backbone that was no longer quite what the drawings promised. None of this was visible from the deck. To the eye, she was a fine, big ship, and she carried her coal for years without the slightest sign of trouble. But engineers who knew her class would later point to exactly these two facts: the spine built for light coal, and the spine slowly eaten by acid, and they would say that here, in the plain iron of her construction, lay the likeliest answer to the whole mystery. A ship strong enough for coal is not necessarily strong enough for stone, and a ship whose backbone has been thinned by 10 years of corrosion has a margin of safety that is smaller than anyone can see, waiting to be found out by the wrong load in the wrong sea. There is a cruel innocence in those early years, seen from the far side of what came after. She was inspected and classed and pronounced fit, and by every ordinary measure she was. Her plating was sound, her rivets tight, her machinery well made, and no surveyor running a practiced hand along her frames in 1910 would have marked her for a doomed ship. The flaw in her was not a fault of workmanship that a good inspection could catch. It was a limit written into her very purpose, invisible precisely because it was so basic, and it would sleep in her untouched for 8 long years, until the day someone poured the wrong cargo into her holds and asked her to carry it across an ocean. Remember the spine, because the story will return to it at the very end, in the cold light of forensic reconstruction. Remember that she was strong for coal, and that coal was light, and that her strength had been quietly wasting for years before anyone thought to look. For now, she was a sound ship with a hidden weakness that had never once been tested, because she had never once been asked to do anything but the work she was made for. That was about to change. In the spring of 1917, the United States entered the greatest war the world had yet seen, and the quiet collier was commissioned into the Navy proper and handed a captain. And of all the strange and troubling threads in the story of the Cyclops, none is stranger than the man who now stepped onto her bridge. The man who held 300 lives in his hands had spent his own life pretending to be someone else. His name, on the papers of the United States Navy, was George Worley, Lieutenant Commander, an officer of the Naval Auxiliary Reserve, an American shipmaster of long experience. That was the surface, and it was a lie built carefully over many years. Underneath it was another man entirely. He had been born Johann Friedrich Wichmann in the village of Sandstedt, in the German Kingdom of Hanover, in the 1860s. He was a German from the heart of the country his adopted nation was now at war with, and he had hidden that fact so completely that even the Navy that commissioned him did not know the truth until after he was gone. The story of how he became George Worley reads like something out of a cheap and violent novel. As a young man, he had crossed to America the hard way by jumping ship in San Francisco in the 1870s and simply disappearing into the port. In the rough world of the waterfront, he made himself a new life and, in time, a new name, taking the surname Worley from a fellow seaman and burying Johann Wichmann somewhere behind him. He kept a saloon on the Barbary coast of San Francisco, that famous stretch of vice and danger, and he went to sea as a master of merchant ships, carrying cargo across the Pacific from the Far East, some of it honest, and some of it, by certain accounts, not, with whispers of opium in the holds. By the time the war brought him into the Navy, he had been at sea, under his invented name, for the better part of 40 years. What kind of man he was, the record leaves in no doubt at all, because after the Cyclops was lost, the Navy's own investigators gathered the testimony of the men who had served under him, and it is a portrait of something close to tyranny afloat. He was, they said, a brutal and erratic commander, a man who berated and cursed his officers and his crew over the smallest of faults, and who could turn from that to sudden violence. On one occasion, it was said, he had chased a young officer the length of the ship, brandishing a pistol. His men had a name for him, spoken behind his back, the damned Dutchman, the old sailor's rough word for a German. To the crew of the Cyclops, their captain was not a leader, but a danger, an unpredictable and frightening presence who ruled the ship by fear. And yet the picture is stranger than mere cruelty, because woven through the fear was something almost absurd. This same tyrant, this pistol-waving terror of the lower deck, was remembered for making his rounds of the ship in his own peculiar uniform, dressed in nothing but his long woolen underwear and a derby hat perched on his head, wandering the decks of a United States naval vessel like a figure from a bad dream. He kept experienced officers confined to their quarters over some imagined slight, and handed their duties to men who had no idea how to perform them. The Navy's later summary of his character reached for the darkest captains in all of seafaring literature to describe him, comparing his command to that of the mad and vengeful captains of fiction, men who drove their ships and their crews toward ruin through the sheer force of their own disorder. It is worth pausing to be fair to him, because a frightened crew is not the same thing as a guilty man, and much that was later said about George Worley was said by men who hated him, in a country gripped by a fever of suspicion against anything German. There is no proof that he was a bad seaman. He had held a master's ticket for decades, and had brought many ships safely across many oceans, The confinements and the rages and the derby hat make him sound like a monster or a madman, but they do not, in themselves, explain the loss of a ship. Plenty of tyrants have commanded plenty of vessels and brought them home. What the portrait of Worley does is poison the water. It means that when the Cyclops vanished, no one who had known the man could quite bring themselves to believe it was a simple accident, because everything about him invited a darker reading. A ship, in the end, takes the temper of the man who commands her, and the Cyclops in her last months was a fearful place to serve. Orders came down harsh and unpredictable. Punishments fell without warning, and the officers, who should have been the captain's trusted circle instead, kept their distance and their silence. A crew that fears its captain does not question his judgment, does not challenge a bad decision, does not speak the word that might save a ship. Whatever else Worley's command did to that unhappy vessel, it bred exactly the kind of silence in which mistakes go uncorrected, the silence of frightened men who have learned that speaking up costs more than it is worth. That is the trap the whole mystery sets, again and again. Here was a German-born captain, hiding his origins, hated by his crew, rumoured to consort with German sympathisers in command of an American warship in a war against Germany, and then that warship vanished off the face of the sea. It is almost impossible not to draw a line straight from the man to the disappearance, not to whisper the word treason, not to imagine some dark design carried out on a lonely bridge in the middle of the ocean. Hold that suspicion, because the story will follow it all the way to its end and weigh it honestly. But hold, too, the quieter possibility that a strange and frightening captain is sometimes just a strange and frightening captain, and that the thing which killed the Cyclops was not in the man at all, but in her holds. For it was under this captain, in the first days of 1918, that she was sent south on the voyage that would destroy her, and given a cargo she had never been built to carry. They sent a coal ship to carry stone, and the stone was heavier and stranger than anything she had ever held. In January of 1918, the Cyclops was assigned to a new command, the Naval Overseas Transportation Service, the branch that moved the vast tonnage of material a nation at war has to shift across the oceans. Her orders sent her far from her familiar waters, south across the equator to the coast of Brazil, to fuel the British warships that patrolled the South Atlantic hunting German raiders. She sailed from the American coast in the first weeks of the new year and made her way down to Rio de Janeiro, and there she did her ordinary work, delivering her coal, earning once again the thanks of grateful governments. And then she was given the load that would carry her to the bottom. She was to bring home manganese ore. It is not a word that carries much drama, but it was a substance the war could not do without. For manganese is the metal that makes steel hard, and hard steel is the stuff of armor plate and gun barrels and shells, the raw hunger of an industrial war. The mills and the arsenals of the United States needed it by the shipload, and the Cyclops, a great empty collier riding high after giving up her coal, was exactly the vessel to carry it north. So into her holds at Rio went thousands of tons of manganese ore, and with that ordinary, sensible, entirely reasonable decision, the trap that had been built into her at the Philadelphia yard 8 years before was quietly sprung. For manganese ore is nothing like coal, where coal is light and bulky and fills a great volume for its weight, or is dense and heavy and concentrated. A given tonnage of it taking up far less space, sitting low and hard in the bottom of the holds in a way coal never does. A hull designed so that its cargo would press evenly through a large volume was now loaded with a cargo that concentrated its enormous weight down low and in the centre, straining the ship in ways her builders had never planned for and never tested. The iron spine that had been amply strong for a large, light load of coal was now asked to carry a small, dense mountain of stone, and no one aboard, and no one ashore, seems to have stopped to ask whether the arithmetic still held. There was worse in the nature of the ore than its mere weight, and it would take a maritime expert most of a century to spell it out clearly. Manganese ore, examined long afterward by an investigator working for a British inquiry into the loss, was not a stable and settled cargo at all. It was loaded loose into holds meant for coal, and the great hatches over those holds were closed not with solid steel, but with covers of canvas. And the ore itself, when it grew wet, could turn treacherous, the fine, dense material taking up water until it began to behave less like solid rock and more like a heavy, sliding slurry, a mass that could shift its weight suddenly and violently from one side of the ship to the other. A cargo that slides is one of the oldest terrors of the sea, because a ship depends for her life on the weight within her staying where it is put. Let that weight lurch to one side in a seaway, and a ship can be thrown into a list she cannot recover from, and can go over before anyone understands what is happening. Here, then, is the ship as she stood in the harbour at Rio, loaded and ready for the long voyage home. And here is everything that was already wrong with her, laid quietly in place. A hull built for the light, even weight of coal, filled instead with a dense, concentrated mountain of ore. A spine engineered for one cargo and, on ships of her kind, slowly eaten by the acid of the old cargo for years. A load that could turn to sliding slurry if the sea got into it under its canvas covers. Not one of these things, on its own, would necessarily have sunk her. Ships carry ore across oceans every day, but they had all been assembled now in one hull, and set against them was no margin to spare, because the Cyclops was about to leave Brazil carrying more weight than she was ever rated to hold, on an engine that was already broken. There is a detail here that sharpens the whole picture, for the loading of that ore at Rio was reportedly overseen not by an experienced hand, but by an officer with little proper knowledge of the work, one of Worley's inexperienced substitutes set to a task he did not understand, while men who knew better were kept from it. A collier's crew knew coal. They did not know ore. They did not know how it must be trimmed and packed and secured to keep it from shifting, and there was no one aboard with both the knowledge and the authority to insist that it be done right. The most dangerous cargo the Cyclops had ever carried was stowed, in all likelihood, by the very people least equipped to stow it safely, and the ship put to sea with that quiet failure buried deep in her holds. She was, in the plain judgment of the men who would later study her, overloaded. Her safe maximum, the most she was ever meant to carry, was 8,000 tons. The manganese ore in her holds came to something close to 10,800 tons, near enough 2,800 tons beyond her rated limit, a ship pressed down far below the line that marks the boundary of safety. A sound ship, new and strong and lightly laden, might shrug off a great deal. The Cyclops was not lightly laden. She was carrying a third again more than she should have, in a form she was never designed for, with a backbone that may already have been quietly failing. And as if all of that were not enough, before she ever cleared the Brazilian coast, one half of her heart had stopped beating. Before she ever left Brazil, one of her two great engines lay dead in its housing, and she sailed anyway. The Cyclops was driven by two enormous engines, turning two shafts and two screws. And the pairing was not merely for speed, but for safety. For a ship with two engines has a redundancy built into her, a second heart to carry her home if the first should fail. Somewhere in her long service, or in the hard work of that final voyage, the starboard engine broke down. One of the great cylinders had cracked, a serious and disabling injury to the machinery, and it could not be properly repaired with the means at hand. The engine was, in effect, dead. From that point on, the Cyclops could steam on one engine only, half her power gone, one shaft turning and one hanging idle in the water. This was not a secret failure discovered too late. Captain Worley himself reported it before the ship left Brazil, and a survey board, the proper body of officers assembled to judge such things, examined the damage and confirmed it. The starboard engine was out of action and could not be made good where she lay. And here the record hands down one of the most haunting details in the whole affair, because the survey board, having looked at a great overloaded ship with one engine dead, did not clear her to steam thousands of miles home across the open Atlantic. It recommended, instead, that she be returned to the United States, which in the plainest reading meant that she ought not to have been sent off on a long ocean passage in the condition she was in. The warning was given, it was written down, and the Cyclops sailed anyway. Try to hold the full weight of her situation as she prepared to leave. She was carrying a third more cargo than she was rated for. That cargo was dense and concentrated low, and capable of turning to a sliding slurry if the sea reached it. Her hull was built for a lighter, kinder load, and its spine may have been thinned by years of corrosion. And now she would attempt the long haul home on a single engine, with half her power and half her ability to hold her head into a heavy sea, or to drive clear of dangerous weather. Every single margin of safety a ship carries, the reserve of strength, the reserve of stability, the reserve of power, had been spent or halved or quietly compromised, all of them at once, before the dangerous part of the voyage had even begun. She was setting out to cross an ocean with nothing left in reserve at all, and there was, moving through the crowded and unhappy ship, a human atmosphere as troubling as her mechanical one. This was not a taut and confident naval crew. It was a company of men under a captain they feared and despised, on a ship that everyone aboard could feel was riding wrong, and there were darker currents besides. The Cyclops was carrying prisoners, men from the American fleet in Brazilian waters who were being sent home under guard, and among them, by report, was at least one man under a sentence of life. There were rumors, later relayed by the American consul at Barbados, of disturbances on the passage up from Brazil, of men confined, and of a killing, an execution, said to have taken place aboard. How much of this was solid fact, and how much was the dark embroidery that gathers around a doomed ship, no one can now say. But it paints the picture of a vessel that was troubled in every part of her, in her cargo, in her machinery, and in the very men who walked her decks. She had come north from Rio in stages. She had put to sea from Rio de Janeiro on the 16th of February and called at the Brazilian port of Salvador in the region of Bahia, arriving on the 20th. 2 days later, on the 22nd of February, she departed Salvador for Baltimore, with no further stops scheduled, carrying her oar and her prisoners and her frightened crew and her single working engine out into the Atlantic for the long run home. On the charts, it was a straightforward passage, up the coast of South America, across the Caribbean, and north to the Chesapeake. For a sound ship in good order, it would have been unremarkable. For the Cyclops, in the state she was in, every mile of it was a gamble against arithmetic that had already turned against her. Think for a moment about what a single engine truly costs a ship at sea. 2 engines are not merely twice the speed. They are the power to hold a heavy vessel steady with her bow into a rising sea, to claw away from a dangerous shore, to drive through the front of a storm rather than wallow helpless in its heart. Lose one, and a ship loses not just her pace, but her ability to fight the ocean at all, to choose her own attitude to the waves, instead of simply enduring whatever they choose to do to her. The Cyclops was setting out to cross a wide and unpredictable ocean, stripped of exactly that power, low and heavy and slow, at the worst possible time in her life to be without it. But she did not, in the end, steam straight home. Somewhere on that passage north, something about her condition became alarming enough that her captain turned aside from his course and put in, unscheduled and unplanned, at the British island of Barbados. It was a small deviation on the chart, a day or two of delay, an ordinary call for coal and provisions. It would also be the last time in all of history that the United States Navy collier Cyclops was ever seen by anyone who lived to tell of it, and the man who dealt with her there would come away so disturbed that he would put his unease into an official telegram to his government and give the whole mystery its most haunting words. At Barbados, the water stood above the line that says a ship is loaded past safety, and a worried consul watched her go. The Cyclops came into the harbour at Bridgetown at the beginning of March, riding low and heavy, and she took on fresh provisions and, by the consul's account, more coal for her bunkers. On the face of it, there was nothing sinister in the stop. A ship makes an unscheduled call, tops up her stores, and goes on her way, and it happens 1,000 times a year without meaning anything at all. But the man who dealt with her, the United States consul on the island, a careful official named Charles Ludlow Livingston, formed an impression of the ship and her captain in those few days that troubled him enough to write to Washington, and the letter he sent is the last clear human record of the Cyclops while she still lived. There was, first, the plain physical fact of how she sat in the water. She was riding so low that the sea stood above her plimsoll line, the row of markings painted on the hull of every merchant vessel to show the limit past which she must not be loaded. The internationally agreed boundary of safety worked out over long and bitter experience of ships that sank because they carried too much. On the Cyclops, that line was underwater. To any seaman's eye, it was the visible sign of a ship loaded beyond what she should safely carry, sitting deeper than she had any right to sit. It must be said in fairness that an investigation back in Rio would later hold that she had been loaded and secured properly by the standards applied to her, so the exact degree of danger is a matter of dispute. But the image remains, a great warship lying so heavy in a Caribbean harbour that her safety line had vanished beneath the surface. Then there was the captain, and the strange unease he left behind him. Livingston found Worley reticent, closed, unwilling to say much, and he gathered from others on the island an impression of a man disliked and distrusted by his own officers, the damned Dutchman once again. He heard the rumours of the troubled passage up from Brazil, of the confined men and the reported execution and the prisoners in the hold. He noted, in the careful way of a consular official, that a great many of the names on the ship's roll were German names, in a ship commanded by a German-born man in the middle of a war against Germany. And out of all of it, out of the low riding hull and the silent captain and the whispered stories and the German names, he assembled a feeling he could not fully justify and could not shake. He put that feeling into an official telegram to the State Department, and its words have echoed down the whole century since. He set down the plain facts as he had them: the poor condition of the engines, the coal she had taken, the provisions she had bought, the Consul General Gottschalk travelling aboard as a passenger, the 231 crew exclusive of officers and passengers, the many Germanic names upon the roll. And then, at the end, he added the sentence that turns the whole document from a report into a premonition. While not having any definite grounds, he wrote, "I fear a fate worse than sinking, though possibly based on instinctive dislike felt towards the master. It is an extraordinary thing for a careful official to commit to an official wire, a confession of dread that he himself admits may be nothing more than the shadow of his own suspicion. But he sent it, and within days it would read like prophecy, a fate worse than sinking. Livingston never said what he meant by it, and perhaps he did not fully know. He may have been thinking of treason, of a German captain handing his ship and her cargo over to the enemy. He may have been thinking of mutiny on that unhappy vessel, of the prisoners and the disturbances and the fear. He may simply have felt, as careful men sometimes do, a cold breath of wrongness about the whole business, and reached for the darkest words to hand. Whatever he meant, the phrase has hung over the Cyclops ever since, because within a week or two of his writing, the ship did indeed suffer a fate that many have felt was, in its way, worse than an ordinary sinking. She suffered a disappearance so complete that it denied her dead even the small mercy of a known grave. It is worth sitting for a moment with the strangeness of that document, and because it is the last human voice to speak of the Cyclops while she still floated. Everything after it is silence and inference. Here, set down in a consul's careful hand, is a living ship in a real harbour, her engines poor, her captain grim, her decks crowded with uneasy men, and a watching official reaching, almost against his own reason, for the language of dread. He filed his report, and the ship prepared to sail, and the ordinary business of the harbour went on around a vessel that had, though not one soul yet knew it, only hours of the known world left to her. On the 4th of March, 1918, the Cyclops let go her lines at Barbados and stood out of the harbour, turning her bow to the north for the run up to Baltimore. She was expected there on the 13th of March, 9 days later, a routine passage across familiar water. Somewhere behind her, the last boats and the last watchers on the Barbados shore saw her hull grow small against the horizon and then slip below it, low in the water, heavy with oar. One screw turning, 300 men aboard. That was the last that any human being who lived to speak of it ever saw of the United States Navy collier Cyclops. She sailed north into the bright Caribbean afternoon, and she sailed straight out of the world, and the wireless set she carried, which could have flung a single word of warning across hundreds of miles of empty air, stayed silent from that hour forward, and has stayed silent ever since. Baltimore expected her on the 13th of March, and the pier stayed empty. And then the questions began. At first there was no alarm at all, and that is worth understanding, because it tells you how ordinary her passage was supposed to be. Ships ran late, weather slowed them, engine trouble delayed them, orders changed and diverted them, and a vessel a day or two overdue was a matter for mild impatience, not for fear. So when the 13th of March came and went, and the Cyclops did not appear at Baltimore, no one yet imagined a catastrophe. She was late. Ships were late. Someone would hear from her soon. But the days went by, and no word came. She was not at Baltimore, and she was not at any other port, and no station along the whole coast had heard her wireless, and no ship at sea reported speaking to her. The mild impatience curdled slowly into unease, and the unease into a dawning and terrible suspicion, as the plain fact settled over the Navy that a great ship and every man aboard her had failed to arrive and could not be found. Searches were mounted. Warships and other vessels were sent to sweep the waters along her expected track, up from the islands and across toward the Chesapeake, looking for her boats, for wreckage, for anything at all. They found nothing. The sea where she should have been was simply empty. There was a single thread that seemed, for a moment, to offer something to hold. A molasses tanker named the Amolco reported having sighted a ship that might have been the Cyclops off the coast of Virginia on the 9th of March, some days into her passage north. If it were true, It would place her far up her track, nearly home. But the report did not survive examination. The captain of the Amolco denied having made it, and the timing made little sense, for a ship off Virginia on the 9th would have been almost within reach of Baltimore, only a day or so out, and there was no reason such a vessel would then vanish on the very doorstep of her port. The sighting dissolved into nothing, as every lead in the case of the Cyclops seemed fated to do, and left the searchers exactly where they had begun, staring at an empty ocean. By the middle of April, the Navy could no longer keep the matter quiet, and on the 15th of that month, the disappearance broke across the front pages of American newspapers. A great naval collier missing with hundreds of men aboard, feared lost, cause unknown. The country, already sending its sons to die in the trenches of France, now confronted a loss of a different and more baffling kind. A warship gone without a shot, without a battle, without an explanation, somewhere in its own home waters. The papers reached for the number they had and reported some 293 persons feared lost, though the true figure aboard was higher still and would settle in the histories at around 306, with some accounts running to 309. Whatever the exact count, it was an entire ship's company gone. For a while, hope was held out, because hope is the last thing to drown. Perhaps she had been captured and taken into some port. Perhaps she was adrift and disabled somewhere, her wireless dead, waiting to be found. Perhaps the men were prisoners, alive, and would come home when the war ended. But the weeks passed and became months, and no captured ship was found in any German record, and no drifting hulk was sighted, and no prisoners emerged, and slowly even hope gave out. On the 1st of June, 1918, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a young man named Franklin Roosevelt, who would one day lead the nation through a far greater war, signed the order that declared the Cyclops officially lost, and all her hands presumed dead. A great ship had been struck from the list of the living, and set down instead in the far shorter and far darker list of the vanished. For the families ashore, the not knowing was its own particular torture, and it went on far longer than any sinking. When a ship is known to have gone down, grief at least has somewhere to begin. When a ship is merely overdue, then missing, then feared lost, hope and dread take turns tormenting the people who wait, day after day, week after week, scanning the newspapers for a name, starting at every knock upon the door. Wives and mothers wrote to the Navy asking for word, and the Navy had no word to give them, because it had none itself. Some clung for months to the belief that their men were prisoners in Germany and would come home when the war was won. And when the war was won and no one came, they had to begin their grieving over again from the start, with still no body and still no grave and still no answer. The Cyclops did not take 300 lives cleanly and quickly. She took them, and then she made the people who loved them wait years to be sure that they were truly gone. And so the Navy was left with the hardest thing an institution built on facts can be handed: a total absence where an explanation should be. There was no wreck to survey, no survivor to question, no wireless log of a final hour, no body to examine. There was only the shape of the hole she had left, a warship and 300 men subtracted from the world between two ports. Into that hole, inevitably, the theories came rushing, each one trying to fill the silence with a cause, and the first and most natural of them, in that spring of a desperate war, was the enemy. Somewhere out in the dark, surely a German had done this. It was wartime, and the first thought was a German torpedo somewhere out in the dark. It was the most natural explanation in the world, and in the spring of 1918, It was very nearly the only one anyone wished to hear. The United States was locked in war with Germany. German submarines, the dreaded U-boats, were the terror of the Atlantic, and they were known to range far across the ocean, even into the waters of the West Indies, hunting the shipping that fed the Allied war effort. Here was an American warship, carrying a cargo of manganese ore bound for the arsenals of the United States, a legitimate and valuable target, and she had vanished on a passage through waters where German submarines were known to operate. The conclusion seemed to write itself. A U-boat had found her and sent her to the bottom with a torpedo, and that was the end of the mystery. It is a clean and satisfying answer, and it has only one flaw, which is that the evidence refuses to support it. A submarine attack is a violent event. A torpedo striking a loaded ship tears her open, and a ship so struck does not usually vanish without a sign. She burns, she breaks, she throws wreckage across the water, she spills her cargo and her oil, and very often, if there is any time at all, she gets a wireless signal away, a position and a plea, the standard desperate call of a ship under attack. The Cyclops did none of these things. There was no wreckage, no oil, no signal, nothing. And a submarine that sinks an enemy warship in wartime does not usually stay silent about it, for such a sinking is a victory, to be logged and reported, and later boasted of. Yet no German submarine ever claimed her. That last point is the one that quietly demolishes the whole theory, and it did not have to wait for modern scholarship, for the Germans themselves denied it at the time and went on denying it afterward. During the war, the German authorities disclaimed any knowledge of the Cyclops, any attack upon her, any sighting of her at all. And after the war, when Germany was defeated and her secrets were open to the victors, the records of her navy were searched precisely to answer this question, to find the U-boat and the patrol and the log entry that would explain the loss of the American collier. Nothing was found. No German submarine had been in the right place. No German commander had reported the sinking. No German record anywhere acknowledged so much as an encounter with her. If a U-boat had killed the Cyclops, it had done so and then erased itself as completely as its victim, which is to say that it had almost certainly not happened at all. There is a further difficulty, quieter but telling. The waters where she was lost, the broad passage from the islands up toward the American coast, were not, in that period, the killing ground that the approaches to Britain and France had become. And the manner of her going, that absolute and total silence, fits an attack very poorly and fits some sudden structural catastrophe very well. A torpedoing is loud and messy and public. What happened to the Cyclops was silent and clean and private, witnessed by no one and announced by nothing. The more closely the enemy action theory is examined, the less it explains, until it stands revealed as what it probably always was, the answer people reached for because it was wartime, and an enemy was the thing they most expected to find. There was a second form the enemy theory could take, that she had struck a mine rather than met a submarine, and it fails for much the same reasons. Mines drift, and mines are laid, and a ship that strikes one is torn open and often burns, and once again leaves her wreckage and her oil upon the water, and, given any time at all, her cry upon the wire. But there is a deeper problem still with any theory of enemy action, and it is one of simple record. The whole vast machinery of the war at sea was obsessive about its own accounting. Every submarine kept a log, every raider reported its sinkings, every minefield was charted by the navy that laid it. And after the war, when all of that German record was opened and searched, there was simply no entry anywhere that answered to the Cyclops, no patrol in her waters at her hour, no torpedo fired, no field laid across her track. For an act of war to have destroyed her, It would have had to be an act of war that no one on the winning side or the losing side ever wrote down, in a conflict that wrote down very nearly everything. It is not impossible. It is only, on all the evidence there is, deeply unlikely. And so the first theory failed, and its failure left the mystery not smaller but larger. Because if no enemy had sunk her, then whatever had happened to the Cyclops was stranger than an act of war. But the human mind does not tolerate a vacuum where an explanation should be, and if the enemy was not out in the dark water, then perhaps, some began to think, the enemy had been aboard all along. Perhaps the danger had never been a torpedo at all. Perhaps it had been standing on her own bridge, in long woolen underwear and a derby hat, a German who had hidden his name for 40 years. The suspicion that had hung over Captain Worley from the first now swelled into a full and sinister theory of its own. If no enemy sank her, then perhaps the enemy had been standing on her own bridge all along. It was a theory that fed on everything troubling about the Cyclops and her captain, and in the feverish atmosphere of 1918, it found a ready and hungry audience. Consider how neatly the pieces seemed to fit. Her captain was German-born, a man named Wichmann, hiding behind the name Worley, a native of the very enemy nation. He was hated and distrusted by his own officers. His ship carried, by the consul's own count, a great many German names upon her roll. And travelling aboard as a passenger was the American consul general from Rio de Janeiro, a man named Alfred Gottschalk, who was himself widely suspected of pro-German sympathies. Assemble those facts in the mind of a frightened wartime public, and a dark story tells itself. The German captain, perhaps with the German sympathizing diplomat, had seized his own ship and delivered her, cargo and crew and all, into the hands of the enemy. The Office of Naval Intelligence took the possibility seriously, as in the circumstances it was bound to do, and it investigated the loss of the Cyclops as a possible act of treachery. It was the intelligence men who dug into Worley's past and uncovered the truth of his origins, the birth in Hanover, the real name, the jumped ship in San Francisco, the 4 decades of concealment. All of it looked, on its face, deeply suspicious, and all of it was set down in the file. Here was a man who had lied about who he was for his entire adult life, in command of a warship that had vanished in wartime. If ever a set of facts seemed to point toward betrayal, it was this one. And yet, when the investigators had gathered everything they could find, the case for treason simply was not there. Concealing a German birth is not the same as committing treason, and a lifetime of hiding an awkward origin, while it may make a man a liar, does not make him a traitor. The intelligence service found no evidence, none at all, that Worley had been disloyal to the United States. No contact with the enemy, no plot, no plan, no sign that he had done anything with his ship but attempt, badly perhaps, to bring her home. Nor was there any evidence that his crew had conspired at mutiny, whatever the rumours from the passage up from Brazil. The most that could be said, in the careful language of a later official summary, was that the Cyclops had suffered from what a modern navy would call a poisonous command, a ship made wretched by a bad captain. A wretched ship is not the same as a treasonous one. It is worth being clear and fair about what was happening here, because it is one of the quieter lessons of the whole affair. The theory of the traitor captain was built almost entirely out of prejudice, out of the simple fact of a man's German birth in a year when Germany was the enemy, and German blood was, to a frightened public, a mark of suspicion in itself. The evidence for his guilt was that he was German, and that his ship was lost. That is not evidence. It is fear wearing the costume of reason. George Worley may well have been a brutal and difficult and even a frightening man, and nothing here is meant to soften that. But brutality is not betrayal. and there is no honest reading of the record that convicts him of handing his ship to the enemy. And after the war, the German records that would have proved any such thing were searched, and once again, they held nothing at all. The passenger Gottschalk deserves a fairer word than the rumour ever gave him, for he too went down with the ship and could never answer the whispers made about him. He had been the American Consul General at Rio de Janeiro, and he was travelling home, by his own account, to offer his services to his country in the war. That a man of German descent, with a fondness for German culture, should have been assumed, on those grounds alone, to be a secret agent of the enemy, tells you a great deal about the temper of the times and very little about the man himself. He was never charged with anything, never shown to have done anything at all, and he died alongside the very crew he was later supposed to have helped betray. The treason theory, in the end, asks its believers to convict two dead men of a monstrous crime on no evidence but their ancestry, and then to explain by that crime a disappearance that their ancestry does nothing whatever to explain. It is the ugliest of the theories, and the emptiest, and it says far more about the fears of 1918 than it will ever say about the fate of the Cyclops. So the second great theory failed, as the first had failed, and its failure was in some ways the more unsettling because it had promised a villain and a motive, a human hand behind the horror, and it could not deliver one. No enemy without had sunk her, and no traitor within had betrayed her. The Cyclops had simply, monstrously, ceased to exist, and neither the malice of Germany nor the treachery of her own captain could account for it. And it is exactly at this point, where the rational explanations run dry and the human need for a cause remains as sharp as ever, that a different kind of answer came creeping in to fill the void, an answer that asked no evidence and offered no proof, and that would attach itself to the name of the Cyclops for the rest of the 20th century. When the facts refused to answer, the legend arrived to fill the silence with something worse than nothing. The Cyclops had been lost in a broad stretch of the western Atlantic between the American coast, the islands, and the open ocean, and in the decades after her disappearance, that region acquired a name and a reputation that owed more to storytelling than to the sea. It came to be called the Bermuda Triangle, and it was said to be a place where ships and aircraft vanished at a rate beyond all reason, snatched out of the world by some force that science could not name. And of all the vessels ever gathered into that legend, none was a more perfect fit than the Cyclops, for she was large, she was real, she was documented, and she had genuinely disappeared without a trace. She became a cornerstone of the myth, one of its founding cases, cited again and again as proof that something in those waters swallowed ships whole. The theories that grew up around the triangle to explain such losses were exotic and various, and it is worth naming them, if only to see how far the human mind will travel to avoid a dull answer. Some spoke of vast eruptions of gas from the seabed, great bubbles of methane rising from beneath the ocean floor that could, in principle, reduce the density of the water so suddenly that a ship would lose her buoyancy and drop like a stone. Others reached further still, to sunken civilizations, to strange magnetic anomalies that swallowed compasses and instruments, to forces frankly supernatural, and in the more colourful tellings, to visitors from beyond the world entirely, plucking ships and crews out of the sea for reasons no human could fathom. The Cyclops, silent and traceless, could be fitted to any of these, because a ship that leaves no evidence can be made to prove anything at all. But the Bermuda Triangle, examined honestly, is far less than it claims to be, and the researchers who took the trouble to examine it have taken it apart piece by piece. When the famous vanishings were checked against the actual records, again and again they turned out to be either exaggerated or misreported, or perfectly explicable by ordinary causes, storms and human error and simple bad luck. the same things that claim ships in every ocean on Earth. The region is heavily traveled, crossed by enormous volumes of shipping and aircraft, and it is swept by sudden and violent weather, and a busy stretch of dangerous water will naturally produce a steady toll of losses without any need for the supernatural at all. One careful investigator, who devoted a whole study to the mystery, reached the flat and deflating conclusion that there was no mystery, that the triangle was a manufactured legend, and that its famous cases, the Cyclops among them, were far better explained by the sea itself than by anything stranger. And here the story of the Cyclops turns a hard and important corner, because the moment the triangle is set aside, the fog begins to clear, and something solid appears through it. There was, on the very days the Cyclops was steaming north, real weather in her path, documented and severe. Around the 10th of March 1918, a violent storm swept across the region of the Virginia Capes, up toward the northern end of her track, strong enough to do real damage ashore and to raise a heavy and dangerous sea. If the Cyclops was where she was expected to be, working her way up toward the Chesapeake, she would have run straight into it, a great overloaded ship with a dead engine, low in the water under a shifting cargo of ore, meeting a genuine gale on a genuine sea. Suddenly, there is no need for methane or magnetism or beings from another world. There is only a wounded ship and a real storm, meeting at the worst possible moment. It is easy to see why the legend took such firm hold, and easy to forgive the people who believed it. There is something almost unbearable about a disappearance with no cause, a hole torn in the world with no edges to it, and the mind reaches instinctively for a shape to give the thing, even a monstrous shape, because a monster is at least a kind of answer, and an answer is a kind of comfort. To say that a triangle of ocean simply swallows ships is, in its strange way, more bearable than to say that a ship can be lost with all her people, and no living soul will ever truly know how. But comfort is not truth, and the honest study of the triangle strips the comfort away and hands back the harder thing in its place. The waters where the Cyclops died are not cursed. They are merely wide and busy, and sometimes violent, and entirely capable of killing a wounded ship by wholly ordinary means, and then keeping her, as the ordinary sea keeps so many of her dead, without any need of magic at all. This is the turn from the fantastic to the forensic, and it is where the true weight of the evidence begins to gather. Strip away the enemy that never claimed her, the traitor who was never proven, and the triangle that never existed, and what remains is a ship carrying every flaw a ship can carry, sailing into weather that would have tested a sound vessel and might well have destroyed a compromised one. The mundane explanation, it turns out, is not the weak one. It is the strong one. And it grows stronger still when you learn what happened, years later, to the sisters of the Cyclops, the ships built to the same drawings in the same yard, when they too were sent out heavy with ore. For the Cyclops, it turns out, was not the only ship of her kind to sail into calm water and never come out. 2 of her 3 sister ships would one day vanish exactly as she had, and both were carrying ore. The Cyclops had been one of 4 vessels of a single class, built to the same design, and the fate of those sisters is the single most powerful piece of evidence in the whole case, because it turns a single lonely mystery into a pattern, and a pattern is a thing that can be understood. If one ship of a class vanishes without trace, it is a mystery. If 3 of the 4 are lost, and 2 of them disappear in almost precisely the same manner as the first, then the finger stops pointing at bad luck and the supernatural, and begins to point, steadily and coldly, at the ships themselves. Follow the sisters. One of them, the Jupiter, was taken in hand and rebuilt into something new, converted into the first aircraft carrier the United States Navy ever put to sea. renamed the Langley, and given a second and famous life. She was lost in the next Great War, sunk by Japanese aircraft in the waters south of Java in 1942, a violent and fully witnessed and entirely explicable end, and she plays no part in the mystery. It is the other two that matter, the Proteus and the Nereus, and their stories are so close to the story of the Cyclops that reading them is like watching the same dark event happen 3 times over. Both the Proteus and the Nereus survived their naval careers and were eventually sold into private commercial hands. And in the early 1940s, more than 20 years after the Cyclops went down, both of them were put to work carrying heavy loads of dense metallic ore, a bauxite cargo, the raw material of aluminium, across the same broad expanse of the Western Atlantic. And within a single month, at the end of 1941, first one and then the other of them sailed out onto that ocean, heavy with ore, and vanished without a trace. No wreckage, no survivors, no distress call, no explanation. 2 more ships of the Cyclops class, carrying 2 more loads of dense ore, gone into the same waters in the same total silence, a quarter of a century after their sister had shown them how it was done. 3 ships of one class then, all lost, and the 2 that most resemble the loss of the Cyclops were both, like her, carrying dense ore when they disappeared. It was neither the enemy nor the triangle, for the sisters were lost in a different war, and any thought of a German torpedo failed for them just as it had for her. What the 3 had in common was not the water they died in, but the steel they were made of and the stone they were carrying. And that pointed the investigators, at last, back to the thing that had been built into all of them at the yard, the long iron spine, and to the acid and to the load these hulls were never truly meant to bear. There was hard corroboration for the fear. On another ship of a closely related design, the collier Jason, the long structural beams were examined and found to be seriously corroded and weakened by exactly the acidic action that coal cargoes were known to cause. The spine of the ship quietly eaten away over years of service. And there was the grim precedent of another ore carrier of similar build, a vessel that was reported to have broken clean in 2 and gone down in calm water, with no storm and no enemy to blame, simply falling apart under the strain of a load her weakened structure could no longer bear. A ship snapping in half on a quiet sea is the plainest possible demonstration of what a failed spine can do, and it is precisely the death that a weakened, overloaded Cyclops, meeting a heavy sea with a shifting cargo, would have been most likely to suffer. Sit with the arithmetic of it, because it is genuinely staggering. 4 ships were built to that single design. 1 was rebuilt into something else entirely, and died a soldier's death under enemy bombs. The other 3 all vanished from the sea. 3 hulls out of 4, gone. And the 2 whose manner of going most closely mirrors the Cyclops were both carrying dense ore when they went. There are not many classes of vessel in the whole history of the sea of which it can be said that most of the class simply disappeared, and fewer still where the survivors of the mystery can point to a single shared weakness written into every one of them at the building yard. The sisters did not merely die, they testified. Across more than 20 years and 2 world wars, in 3 separate silences, the same design of ship carrying the same kind of killing cargo returned the same verdict. And the verdict was not aliens, and it was not the enemy, and it was not a triangle drawn on a chart. It was the steel and the stone it was never truly built to carry. Here, then, the true shape of the answer finally stands clear. Assembled not from 1 ship, but from 3, not from rumour, but from steel. A class of vessel built for light coal, its spine slowly weakened by the acid of that coal over years of service, sent out at last, carrying dense, concentrated ore that its structure was never designed to bear. Add to that, in the case of the Cyclops, an overload of nearly 2,800 tons beyond her rated maximum, a dead engine, a cargo that could shift and slide when wet, and a genuine storm across her path. And you have not a mystery at all, but a machine for producing exactly the disaster that overtook her. What remains is to imagine from all of it the shape of the last few minutes, the thing that no living eye ever saw. Piece the evidence together, and a picture forms of a death so fast it left no time for a single cry. No one witnessed the end of the Cyclops, and no one ever will. And so what follows is not a record, but a reconstruction, built strictly from what is known of her condition, her cargo, and the sea she sailed into. It is the most likely shape of her final hour, drawn from the steel and the ore and the weather, and it explains, as no canon and no captain ever could, the one detail that has haunted the whole story from the beginning, the completeness of the silence. Set her then, somewhere north on her track, in the days around the 10th of March, 1918, working her way up toward the Virginia coast under a darkening sky. She is riding low, deep below her marks, 3,000 tons of dense ore too much held in holds, built for coal. Her starboard engine is dead in its housing, so she has only half her power, only one screw turning to hold her heavy head into the sea and to drive her clear of trouble. And the sea is rising. The storm that swept the Virginia Capes is building around her, the wind climbing, the waves lengthening and steepening, and a great overloaded ship with a single engine has very little ability to work herself into a safer attitude or to run for shelter. She can only take what is coming. Now bring together the flaws, one by one, the way the sea would have brought them together. The waves grow long enough that they begin to lift her at the bow and the stern, while her heavy middle hangs unsupported over the trough between them, and then to lift her amidships while her ends sag, working her spine back and forth with enormous force, the very strain the long iron beams exist to resist. But those beams have been carrying a load they were never designed for, and on ships of her kind they have been thinned for years by the acid of old cargoes, and the margin that should be there is not there. Somewhere in her hull, under a strain that a sound ship would have shrugged off, something in that weakened spine begins to give, and the oar does the rest. As she labours and rolls in the building sea, the dense cargo, perhaps wetted by water working in under the canvas hatch covers, begins to shift, its great concentrated weight sliding to the low side of a roll and staying there, dragging her further over, refusing to come back. A ship depends for her life on the weight inside her staying put, and the weight inside the Cyclops does not stay put. She heels, and the oar slides, and she heels further, and there is no reserve of stability left to right her, and no second engine to help her fight. And the roll that should have been recoverable becomes the roll that is not. Whether her back broke first, and the sea poured into the break, or the cargo shifted first and rolled her under, the result is the same, and it is horribly quick. That is the key to everything, the speed. A ship that breaks her back or capsizes under a shifting cargo does not die the slow, awful, drawn-out death of the great liners, settling gradually while her people take to the boats and her operator taps out call after call into the night. She goes in minutes, or in less. There is no time to launch a boat from a ship rolling swiftly onto her side. There is no time for a man to reach the wireless cabin and send a position. No time for a single word when the deck goes vertical beneath his feet in the space of a few breaths. The lights would have gone as the sea took the engine room. The men below would have had no warning at all, and the men on deck would have had only the last few seconds of a healing world and the cold Atlantic coming up to meet them. It would have been over almost before it began. Hold, for one moment, on the men, because they are the heart of it, and because they had no idea. In the hour before the end, they were doing the ordinary things that men do on a ship at sea, standing their watches, sleeping in their bunks, cursing the weather and the food and the captain, thinking of a home now only days away. The prisoners lay under guard in their compartments. The engine room crew tended their one labouring engine in the heat and the din below the waterline. Not one of them knew that the ship beneath their feet was already lost, that the sum of her flaws had already been added, that the sea had already chosen its moment and was only waiting to arrive at it. Dramatic irony is the cruelest of all the tools a story has, and here it is, at its very cruelest, 300 men going quietly about their small human business on a ship that was, in every way that truly mattered, already gone. And that is why there was nothing. That is why no oil, no boats, no bodies, no call. The manner of her death was the manner most perfectly designed to leave no trace, a sudden structural catastrophe in deep water far from land, swallowing 300 men in a single convulsion too fast for any of the ordinary evidence of disaster to escape her. The wreckage that did break free would have scattered and waterlogged and sunk or drifted uncounted across a vast ocean. The bodies would have gone down with her or been carried away and lost. The wireless never spoke because there was never a moment in which to make it speak. The silence that has baffled the world for a century is not the absence of an explanation. The silence is the explanation. She died the one kind of death that leaves no witness and no word, and then the deep closed over her and kept her. More than a century later, the Cyclops is still down there somewhere, unlocated, uncounted, unexplained. The most powerful navy on Earth lost one of its largest ships in its own home waters, and in all the years since, with all the advances in the searching of the deep, her grave has never been found. There have been leads. There was a report, decades after the loss, of possible wreckage discovered off the Virginia coast, in roughly the waters where the storm would have caught her, and it has drawn the attention of those who hunt for lost ships. But nothing has ever been confirmed as the Cyclops, no hull identified, no name read off a rusting plate, no proof brought up out of the dark. She remains where she fell, wherever that is, one of the very few great modern warships whose resting place is entirely unknown, a ship the size of a small town that the ocean has hidden so well that it has never once been found. And because she was never found, the Navy has never been able to close the file with certainty, and so the official verdict remains today what it was set down as long ago, an admission rather than an answer. Many theories have been advanced, the Navy concluded, but none that satisfactorily accounts for her disappearance. It is an honest sentence, and a haunting one, and it is worth understanding exactly what it does and does not say. It does not say the loss is supernatural, or unexplained in the sense of being unexplainable. The evidence, gathered from her sisters and her cargo and the storm, points hard and consistently toward the plain and terrible answer of a weakened, overloaded ship broken by the sea. What the sentence honestly admits is only that, without the wreck, it cannot be proven, and a service built on proof will not claim a certainty it cannot hold in its hand. There is a bitter irony folded into that honesty, and it is the deepest truth the Cyclops leaves behind. The likeliest explanation for her loss is not a mystery at all, but a chain of entirely ordinary, entirely human failures, every one of them known at the time, and every one of them ignored. She was loaded past her marks, and men saw the water standing over her safety line and let her sail. Her engine was broken, and a survey board said she should go home, and she was sent across an ocean instead. Her hull was built for coal and filled with ore, and no one stopped to ask whether her spine could bear it. Not one of these was an act of God or a stroke of the uncanny. Each was a decision, or a failure to decide, a corner cut in the haste and pressure of a war. The horror of the Cyclops is not that she was taken by something we cannot name. It is that she was most likely taken by things we could have prevented, and then the sea hid the proof so well that we are not even permitted the cold comfort of being sure. Remember, at the last, that she was not a mystery to the people who loved the men aboard her. To them, she was a husband who did not come home, a son whose room stayed as he had left it, a brother whose place at the table was never filled. Among the vanished was an ordinary mess attendant named Lewis Hardwick, a man whose small son would grow up to become a celebrated prizefighter, and who carried through his own life the absence of a father the sea had taken without a word or a grave. Multiply that one absence by 300, and you have the true weight of the Cyclops. Not a puzzle to be solved, but a wound that never closed. 300 families handed a date on a calendar and nothing else at all. No telegram of a sinking, no survivor's account, no body to bury, only a ship that had been in the world one day and was gone from it the next, and so return, at the very end, to the man who had felt it coming. Charles Ludlow Livingston, the consul at Barbados, had watched her sail low and heavy out of his harbour under a captain he could not read, and something in him had reached for the darkest words he had and set them down in an official wire to his government. He had feared, he wrote, a fate worse than sinking, and he had confessed that he could not fully say why. He was thinking, perhaps, of treason or of mutiny, of some human wickedness aboard that unhappy ship. He could not have known that the fate she truly suffered would be worse than sinking in a way he never imagined. Not a betrayal, but an erasure, a disappearance so total that it would deny 300 men even the ordinary dignity of a known and grieving end. She did not merely sink. She was unmade, taken out of the world in silence and hidden past all finding, and left behind her only a question the sea has never once consented to answer. The wireless set she carried could have flung a single word across hundreds of miles of empty air. From the 4th of March, 1918, it never spoke again, and after more than 100 years of listening, the Navy's own verdict on the Cyclops still stands as the last honest word anyone can say of her. Many theories have been advanced, but none that satisfactorily accounts for her disappearance. If this story held you, subscribe, because there is always another great ship and another silent horizon waiting to be told, and every vanished crew deserves to have its name spoken again. And tell me honestly, after everything the evidence shows, do you believe the Cyclops was destroyed by her own flaws, or by something out there that we still cannot name? Say where you are watching from, and I will read every reply.